Okay. Well, good evening, and welcome to those here at AEI, and those watching online, and those watching on C-SPAN. I'm Gary Schmidt. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute in the program on cultural, social, and constitutional studies. This evening's program is a talk and discussion with Professor Richard Samuelson on John Adams, the Constitution, and the Constitution of Human Nature. A topic that might at first seem antiquarian, but given our current debates about constitutional order and its underlying assumptions, it's a topic that remains quite relevant today. Before introducing Professor Samuelson, let me outline this evening's format. Professor Samuelson will talk for about 20 minutes, and then I will join him on the stage for a discussion back and forth, and then we'll end the evening with questions and answers from the audience. And if you have questions online, please submit them. You can find the tagline and the event announcement from AEI. Now, let me briefly introduce Dr. Samuelson. Richard is an associate professor of government at Hillsdale's College, Washington, D.C. campus. He's an historian of the American founding, politics, and the constitutional order. His PhD is from the University of Virginia. Until relatively recently, he taught at California State University, San Bernardino, and previously was a visiting fellow at Princeton University's James Madison program. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Samuelson to AEI. Richard, the mic is yours.
Well, good evening. It's an honor to be here. Thank you for having me, Gary. Thank you for the introduction. And tonight we're talking about John Adams. Just as you may remember, he's known as the lawyer in the Boston Massacre trial, the Atlas of Independence, as he was known, or the Atlas of the pushing the Declaration through on the floor, according to Jefferson in '76, the principal author of the Massachusetts Constitution in 1779, which is, of course, the first state constitution written by a special convention ratified by the people and featuring separation of legislative, executive, judicial powers and a House, Senate, and governor with a qualified veto. He went on to diplomatic office and helped negotiate the end of the revolution and was the first vice president, second president of the United States. And he's also known as one of our great men of letters. His correspondence with Jefferson is one of the great exchanges in American letters. And of course, he's also the father and grandfather, great-grandfather of some of the most distinguished American politicians and writers, historians. But Adams was also, and he's probably underappreciated, as a writer on politics. We don't study him as much, either historians or political theorists, constitutional scholars, to understand how our Constitution is supposed to work, what our constitutional order is like, what checks and balances are, what they're for, why you have two houses, questions like that. And that's unfortunate, because he has a lot to teach us. Now, to understand Adams, though, and put him in the context, I'm a historian after all, of 18th century thought, particularly the second half of the 18th century, maybe you can consider with reference to a point Ernst Cassirer makes in his philosophy of the Enlightenment. Cassirer said, for the Enlightenment, theodicy became a political problem. Theodicy, the problem of evil in light of God's justice. Why is there evil in the world? For the Enlightenment, which I suppose could be summarized if he made an advertising slogan, better living through reason. If human beings are capable of living better, how do you explain the grim record of the past? And that became a political problem, because you can see what the nature of the problem was, right? Now, perpetual peace is, of course, the first problem here, right? That is to say, how do we account for, how do we get rid of war? And this comes up at the time. When you look at Napoleonic Wars, etc. Now, we can get rid of scarcity, of course. A few years ago, Georgia had a serious drought, and some people looked at the original maps, so they remembered this, and they knew they drew it's arguable they drew the border between Georgia and Tennessee incorrectly. And Georgia had a claim that they should have access to the Tennessee River. Now, old school, that's what wars come from. I got a map that says that's my water too. I need water. You go take it, and then you fight. And one wag suggested that the Bulldogs and the Volunteers play a football game to settle the issue. But other than that, that's as far as it went. And that's because, thanks to technology, we've cured the problem of scarcity, or we can, to a great degree, cure that problem. People weren't literally dying of thirst in Georgia at the time, and crops were still getting water to a great degree. Of course, the federal union also helped. But when you look back at the Napoleonic Wars, Jefferson and Adams discussed this. In their first exchange, they were alienated in the 1790s and stopped writing each other. And in 1812, on New Year's Day, Adams writes Jefferson, and that's when they reconcile and have started these great exchanges. In the first letter back, Jefferson writes Adams and says, well, if science, capital S unadorned, produces nothing but war and bloodshed, we'd be better off living like the Indian savages are, to use Jefferson's term, than we are now. Well, why? Well, you don't have to be terribly insightful to think about the consequences of modern technology on war. If wars still happen at something like the rate they've had in the past, or even at a diminished rate, the trajectory of modern weaponry can be anticipated. I mean, you'd seen the steam engine just recently, moving people more quickly. You see the lightning rod, some work with electricity and other things, but also modern weaponry. If that continues to grow, the prospect of war continuing to be a regular feature of human life is downright terrifying, right? It's not a coincidence Mary Shelley writes Frankenstein in 1818, the new Prometheus, right? There's a danger in there. We produce a monster, right? Well, and so that's the war and peace, the international dimension of this problem, right? But we're talking about constitutions. Well, as Joseph said to Pharaoh, it's the same dream. In light of human history, why do you think you can create a constitution that's reasonably stable, that creates reasonable justice? Why do you think you can create a republic that will last, a free republic of equal citizens? Where does that come from? Right? And in particular, the question of the problem of human equality and inequality. Right? And that's where Adams seems to disagree with some of his cohorts. Adams very much thinks inequality is simply a human norm, and not just inequalities for good causes, but inequalities for random causes. Now, if you think about, say, Rousseau and Adams in the start of his long work on the defense of constitutions, at the first substantive chapter after the prefatory remarks, he says, Rousseau says a society of gods would govern themselves equally. And Adams snidely remarks, well, that must not be the Greek gods. But he has extensive discussion of the second discourse, the origins of inequality. And Rousseau distinguishes between those that are natural and those are the ones that are relatively benign, and then the unnatural ones, family names, wealth, all that. Adams reads it entirely differently. He says, no, that's actually not the case. Inequality comes from the human condition. And inequalities are the sort that are, well, from the human perspective, less than benign. I mean, Adams has faith. In the cosmic sense, he's an optimist. God must have made the world this way for a reason. So our job is to make what good we can of it, right? But in the narrow sense, it seems unfortunate that many people seem to be in power who shouldn't be, or have sway who shouldn't be. And Adams thinks this is really going to matter, because in this age of revolutions he's been seeing, and he's starting to see, he spent several years in France, he's in England when he writes the Defense of the Constitutions. He's got to know the people who are trying to make a revolution, and he thinks they're idiots. I mean, they haven't worked in politics by and large, and they expect much too much in terms of their ability to change the world. But if you go back to the second discourse, Rousseau seems to say that human beings, these words progress, meaning movement, the rise and progress of X doesn't mean from lower to higher, But our basic way of living, our nature seemed to change from our primitive condition where we're basically content and living more or less as human animals. And maybe it's best we're a little bit above that, kind of like Paine's distinction in the start of common sense between society and government. And Rousseau says we get very unhappy as we move into civilization, and you get these random unfortunate equalities. Adams thinks, no, those things come together. They're in every human society. His approach to studying human nature is, I suppose I might say, sociological. Now, I'm an historian. I recently learned that Weber used the term political sociology. I have no idea if I'm using the term the same way. I suspect not. Just for any theorists, just put that aside. But what he's saying is study what are humans like in their situation, right? And you want to take an example of how we study human nature. He's young. He's just finished his apprenticeship in law. He's moved back home with his parents. Yeah, some things never change. And his parents have a huge fight, and he's so upset. He goes up to his room and he says, I should have watched, because then I could have seen husbands and wives arguing, right? So what's the point? Well, dogs bark, fish swim, husbands and wives argue. It's going to happen. There will be families, there will be couples, and husbands and wives will get on each other's nerves sometime. That's nature. So too are inequalities. Jefferson and Adams have this great exchange on natural aristocracy, and Jefferson retains, for a shorthand, a Platonic notion of it. That is, those who have virtue and talents will rise. And Jefferson gives it evolutionary character. Formerly, before gunpowder, the strongest guy was a natural aristocrat. He helped keep people in line. But thanks to gunpowder, that equalized that. But now, so virtue and talent are defined in terms of some higher notion. Adams is looking ruthlessly empirically at this, like after the fashion of the scientific method, the modern scientific method. Right? You see these features over and over and over again rise. For example, apparently we know from studies that taller people tend to make more than shorter people. I guess we can call that height privilege. Right? Now, maybe that's random, maybe it's culture, but maybe we're just kind of wired that way. We see hierarchy, we are status-seeking creatures. Adams called beauty a talent. Right? If I remember correctly, when the bell curve came out, and we're sitting here in AEI, my favorite response was, I can't remember if it was Newsweek or the New Republic. They said, actually, IQ doesn't give you that much of an edge. It's looks. Those who are regarded as attractive, they get a huge edge in life. More income, more happiness, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those would not be the type of criterion that are evenly distributed or fair. Adams says, tough noogies. That's the way human beings are wired. You have to deal with factors such as that, putting people ahead. And he'd also say, inequalities of wealth. Rich people, there will be some people with more, almost always, and they will have an edge. Having a famous father or mother, that will give you an edge. I mean, do you really doubt if one of Obama's kids, or a Bush kid, or a Trump kid, etc., ran for office, they'd have an edge, particularly in the male line, so they had the actual name? That just seems a human reality. It is a random factor. There's no necessary connection to talent. But a political system must account for that. Right? In addition, we are status-seeking creatures. We seek that. In any given room, Adams would say, you have 100 people. How many have been on a committee where equal people, where everyone does the same amount of work? Right? It almost never happens. There's always a few people who run things, and usually one most important thing in any given organization or committee. That's the way the world is. And Adams would say, essentially, looking at the classic regime, you see the one, a few, and a many in any gathering of humans. That's just going to happen. And the factors that cause that won't necessarily be those that we would choose behind a veil of ignorance. It's simply the way we're wired. And Adams is thinking, if you try to change that, I think the reason why it goes on for 1,000 pages, right? Turgot would say, well, we see in the American constitutions this imitation of the English Constitution, because England has the king, lords, and commons. The Americans have a Senate and a governor or an executive. He said, why are you doing that? You don't have aristocrats, you don't have a king, just have one house, like the Pennsylvania Constitution of 1776, which was created by Franklin and Paine and others in 1776, the summer of 76 after independence. And that became the ideal of many intellectuals. It also was jettisoned around 1790. It wasn't working out so well. But why? And I'm saying because there are hierarchies by nature. One single house will be subject to he says in 76, will be it's normal passions, flights of passions, anger, irrationalities. You need a second house to draw that off. And he says something different, though. The second house, he thinks, can be kind of an internal ostracism. Why do you need a second house? Well, what are human beings like? He's looking empirically. And remember, empiricism is simply you drop the object, and it drops, do I remember this correctly from high school? 32 feet per second accelerating, and it happens every time. Now, do we know the next time the object won't hold still because we've never seen it before? Actually, we don't know that. From empiricism, we just know we've never seen it, and so it's a good guess, right? So it's just we describe these patterns of human behavior over time. And if inequalities of a certain sort seem to rise over and over again, you have to take them into account in the Constitution, or they will overwhelm your system. And Adams, the second part, is what's, in a sense, that's one. The second part is the answer to that, he thought. He thought the answer to that was an upper house. And that was controversial in the day, because he's not just accepting inequality, he's accepting essentially an upper house, which is kind of aristocratic, at least in its underlying principle. That is, people in the House will aspire to be Senate. My recollection is the Society for State Attorneys General, the AAG is known as the Society for Aspiring Governors, right? It's kind of, we're like that, right? Well, the Senate, he thinks, well, people want the upper house, back when it really was an upper house, right? And that will cabin the more ambitious people. And those people will be talented. They will have capabilities often to do work. But if given the chance, they will serve themselves. And on the other hand, the people being lazy, we are always very happy to let people take care of us. That is huge numbers of people, a certain percentage of the time. Thank you for doing that. Don't worry about it. In the meantime, the rest of us lose our citizenship because we're being taken care of instead of doing the work ourselves, right? The Spider-Man principle, I call it to my students, with great power comes great responsibility. Most of us don't want to be responsible. Ergo, we're happy to thank others for doing the work. So that's the underlying problem. And the other element here is he thinks the political structure, the two houses, plus a governor, plus an executive with a veto. Why? Well, the controlling metaphor is from James Harrington. Harrington, he quotes at length in his defense of the Constitution, says, well, you have two girls with a piece of cake, and how do they divide it to be fair? And my brother and myself did this with kids all the time, right? One cuts and the other chooses. And as I recall, you always want the other guy to cut because you never cut right in the middle. And when you're 6 years old, the worst thing in the world is for your brother to get a little more cake than you, right? But so it's your interest to make a fair division. That's a rough justice, of course. Of course, you need a third balance in there. He was bigger than me, push me and take all the cake. And to have a balance, you need something actually holding the balance. So you need three to have a balanced constitution. You can't just have two. And he thinks that actually serves a character-forming dimension. And I think this sets Adams' view of the Constitution apart from Madison. If you look at Federalist 51 carefully, right, Madison says, well, yes, if men are angels, no government would be necessary. And Adams has said much the same thing earlier. Power must be opposed to power, and interest to interest. Probably borrowing, as Hannah Arendt says, or Hannah Arendt I like to call in honor of her marriage to Herr Blücher, Frau Blücher. She says it's probably quoting Montesquieu. Pouvoir contre pouvoir, same idea, right? But Madison calls those checks and balances auxiliary precautions. They're not the main feature. The main feature for Madison is the extended sphere, the extended republic. Right? It is reliance on the people that's primary for Madison, but he's explicit the reliance on the people does not work in a small republic. And so it's merely auxiliary. For Adams, they are primary. Why? Because they shape the souls of the politicians, and men being imitative, they will shape the rest of us. That is, at the very end, the last paragraph of the Defense of Constitutions, before he closes his famous comment looking at across the water at constitutional ratification, calling it the greatest act of deliberation in human history, of national deliberation in human history. Right? We have this unique opportunity. We're equals. We're able to deliberate more people than at any previous time in history. But amid that equality, amid the equality of citizens, the equality of rights, the equality under law, and Adams would say very importantly, we are a government of laws, not of men. There are going to be regular and predictable inequalities that we must account for. Right? And what he says, if you created even this, the virtues are often an effect of the Constitution as much as a cause. And if you created a republic of highwaymen, crooks running the highway, not Waylon and Willie, and they were forced to divide and choose. One rogue were forced to watch the other. They might be made honest men by the process. That is, the system tames the ambition of your leaders. And after doing it over and over again, you internalize it. By now, my brother and myself have no problem sharing. You want more cake? Fine, right? So after doing that, he retains something of the classical notion that the Constitution shapes the character of the people, shapes the character of those who govern, and shapes the character of the citizens. And he keeps that in line, keeps that into our constitutional regime. And I think in some ways, there's self-consciousness about that role in the government, and is connecting that with some kind of republicanized mixed regime sets Adams apart. And he gives us some particular insight into how our constitutional order can work, and some things we might want to pay attention to. Adams, in the Massachusetts Constitution, quoting other constitutions, said, you should return to principles regularly. That is, you have to go back to your fundamental principles or you will drift. And a frequent recurrence to the fundamental principles of the regime, in addition to honesty, piety, justice, and others, is necessary. But as you do that, you have to know what the principles are and what the human possibilities are. If you have too high a notion of what can be changed in human life, you will probably not get to a good solution. So you must know both the character of your specific people and the character of human nature, particularly human beings involved in politics. And Adams thinks the solution to that is to create some kind of mixed regime, combined, of course, with the separation of legislative, executive, judicial powers, which he's also a strong supporter. And it's an interesting question. Does it actually work? Can you actually use an upper house to create a kind of contained quasi-aristocratic element? Or is that never functional? It doesn't seem to be what's going on today. But I'm wondering if the age of the great triumvirate of Clay, Webster, and Calhoun, that's kind of what we did. And if you look at the Constitutional Convention on June 6th, John Dickinson, who didn't like Adams because he wrote a private letter to Abigail, was leaked, in which Adams criticized Dickinson. But he said, you know what, we need to have one house. This is when they're starting to negotiate towards the Connecticut Compromise, just from the people. But a second one, we have states. We don't have lords, but the states can serve as proxies for the House of Lords. And that's the day Madison writes to Jefferson, who's then in Paris, I can't believe, I'm really frustrated about Adams' influence on the convention. I don't think that's a coincidence. I wonder if, at least in the 19th century, that you combine that Senate representing the states actually kind of did work that way in a certain way. And now in the 20th century, of course, we had direct election and so many other things are different, maybe not. But it does give you some interesting insight into how the constitutional regime was structured. And I wonder if Adams' insight might help us if we reconsider and rethink how things are working nowadays. Thank you very much.
That was great, Richard. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me begin with a sort of something that struck me when you first began. You made mention of the fact that you thought that Adams was in some ways underappreciated, particularly in his political thought, and you did a wonderful job of laying that out. On the other hand, I would say over the last decade plus, we've had a fairly large number of Adams books, and we've even had a TV series which was relatively popular. How do we kind of square the circle? How is it that Adams, with all this new material, his deeper political thought has been not fully appreciated, as you said?
I mean, Adams is very much on the map, right? He's in the 70s, you had 1776 in the Adams Chronicles, and then McCullough's book was, 99? And then the series based on McCullough's book, and now there's Chervinsky, who has their new book on Adams, The Presidency. But yeah, politically, I think he wrote too much and too long.
Yeah.
People don't want to read it. The TLDR really matters when the book is this thick, 3 volumes, and there's more, right? he's also usually the foil. That is, the contrast between Adams and Jefferson is a classic, but usually Adams doesn't get his due. It's really, you quote Adams quickly as the antithesis to Jefferson, as opposed to really get to his thought. And I also think because of the Alien Sedition Acts, he's also one-term president. One-term presidents get less love by and large, although you have to be a rare circumstance for someone who's not a two-term president to be appreciated. Of course, it's political thought, so you really have, you get the Federalist Papers in all your classes, which makes sense. It's condensed, and it's easily accessible. But the Adams Papers are not even doing an annotated version of the defense of the constitutions. Decision they made long ago. That's just no respect. Anyone, can you imagine the Jefferson Papers not doing or not having done an annotated version, notes of the state of Virginia? Right? It doesn't make sense. So there's an underappreciation of political thought, I think partly because it doesn't square with how we're used to thinking about the Republic, and maybe because the books are too thick to be popular. Just one anecdote of that. Adams, when he died, he donated his library to the grammar school in town. Figured good for the kids. Well, you can imagine how much 10-year-olds need to read 15 volumes of Diderot in French. So it wasn't very well used.
Yeah, I mean, it is the case that the 3 volumes are not the easiest thing to get through. I'm impressed that you've actually spent so much time doing it. So, whereas the Federalist Papers, a couple of weeks and you're through it, even if you're not fully, sort of appreciate what's going on sometimes, but nevertheless. So one of the reasons why it's interesting is that when Gordon Wood published his Creation of the American Republic, he seemed to go out of his way to slam Adams as being irrelevant to the American Enlightenment project. That didn't help Adams's reputation at all, because Gordon Wood at the time was so well thought of. How would you respond to Wood in that regard?
Well, Wood's is interesting, right? That chapter, it's the penultimate chapter of a 615 or so page book, right? And Adams is probably quoted more than anyone else in that book, and more than anyone else in his mentor, Bernard Bailyn's Ideological Origins of the American Revolution. And they have this love-hate relationship with Adams. They're not quite sure what to make of him. At the end, he thought Adams has terrific insight, but he's also irrelevant. Why is he irrelevant? Because he misunderstood how constitutional thought was changing. But that misses a fundamental question, right? Wood, given the way he understands history, thinks because everybody was talking differently about how a constitution works, that meant the constitutional order had changed. Of course, it is entirely possible the prevailing discourse about what's going on in the Constitution and the actual function of the Constitution are separate things. But Wood is, if you see Jack Diggins' discussion of the importance of language in Wood's work, it really comes out. That Wood really is, I think, overly impressed by language in that sense, its historical movement, and he misses the question of institutional design. There isn't really room for an actual thinker working through it. To give you an example, and Adams is very self-conscious about the political movements, the cultural, the linguistic movements in his day. And the historian says, that's my job, you're butting in. And it gets us very uncomfortable because the way we're trained mostly is to think about the people of the past. This is what they were like, and we look at them, as opposed to thinking with the people of the past and seeing them illuminate issue. And I think Wood misses that. At the end of that chapter, he says, Adams says, there's no special providence for America, meaning we're of the same clay as others. I don't think he necessarily means what Wood thinks he means. That is, America's not a different kind of nation. Among the possibilities, we might be different from most things that have been tried across history, which is separate from saying, no, we're going to have the same types of problems that are characteristic of all nations. Those two things can be separated.
Yeah. I do think Wood and Balin both have a tendency, not a tendency, I think it's it's the core methodology, which is to take phrases and it's abstracted from actually the larger argument and also the politics and the history of the day. I mean, there's a good reason why it's called the ideological, histories. I mean, but of course, I think that misses the history.
Well, there's a curious and anachronism too that actually is interesting because ideology is invented in the 1790s to describe a certain group of thinkers that Adams opposed. I mean, Jefferson liked them. He had Tracy's work translated. So now that word might take on different meaning over time, but there's still a tension in there if you are disagreeing with the ideologues. And Wood, I mean, just to give you, I don't know, he has a habit of not quoting full sentences and giving not getting the nuance of a thought. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. But when it comes to Adams, I mean, it's relatively common to sort of see people write about Adams as though, in 1775 and 1776, he's very much the optimist about the liberal project, and then you get the defense, and it seems to be more pessimistic about the prospect of the advancement of the liberal project. I take it you don't think that's fair.
Well, if he writes Mercy Warren in 76 and says, well, we're a commercial republic, that's because all kinds of corruptions we have an opportunity people hadn't had. And in the preface of the defense, he says, Americans have the greatest opportunity presented to anyone since the transgression of the first pair. And if we don't do well, we'll merit the punishment of heaven. So he still thinks we have a special opportunity in 87, and in 76 he's already, he's still a son of New England who's worried, for everybody, there's an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other, and that doesn't change.
Yeah. Do you think the defense was written for the American audience, or was it written for European audience?
I think it's both, and that's important too. He's writing in England in 86, 87. He's talking to reformers, and he's known that people want to reform things in France, and he thinks, as I talk, he doesn't think they know what they're doing. I mean, in America, every colony had a legislature, they were used to politics, they had newspapers, 20, 25 by 76, with no prior restraint. So they were basically allowed to publish, an occasional limitation afterwards. Whereas France had 3 newspapers that were legal, all censored by the king, and there were some underground newspapers. No regular politics whatsoever. And then they try to jump to a full representative government of some sort, and they have no experience whatsoever what they're doing. Of course they're going to mess up. But they also don't understand the difference between a sellout and a compromise, because they've never done it. And it's not surprising it winds up rather messy. Plus, their ideas have a mistaken impression about how much change is actually possible. The French, Adams, in some ways, and in the fuller papers, on one of his crossings of the Atlantic, he amused himself by reading Quixote, and in some way he's playing Sancho to the philosophes, men from La Mancha. They're way off on their idealistic, crazy ideas. And he said, no, get down to reality if you want to make a difference. And he was definitely writing for them and writing for the reformers in Europe. In addition, I think, to writing for the Americans. If you look at the last, I should have the volume with me. If you look at the last paragraph of the first volume of Defense, he says, quote, there are 2 ways of dealing with the problems of Republican governments. And they are either by a king or checks and balances. I do not think, it may be complete coincidence, but I would not be surprised if Madison saying, no, the 2 ways, he talks about in Federalist 10, he's saying, you got the wrong 2 ways, Adams, these are them. It's a very famous phrase in Federalist 10, and I think they're arguing about that. So I think he is self-consciously trying to get it out there before the convention meets as well.
Yeah. This French attraction to the Pennsylvania Constitution has always been of interest to me. I mean, I wonder whether the attraction, besides as you mentioned, look, we don't have a lord, so why would we have an upper house from their point of view? But I also wonder whether or not there's something to be said about they thought this was a simpler frame of government, and thereby closer to nature as they understood. So I wonder if there's just a real disagreement about nature between what Adams is assuming and versus what the French intellectuals are assuming.
How robust is nature, right? And I think that's very well, good way of putting it. Where do these mixed regimes come from. Adams, if you ever saw the movie Big Fat Greek Wedding, the father there is very proud Greek, and he can find a Greek root for every single word you mentioned. Well, Adams is kind of like that, except he finds a mixed regime in every history he reads. There's a one, there's a few, there's a many. Now that might be a bit too much, but he thinks in every political situation, those groups are going to form, and they must be accommodated because that's the way human beings associate together. It's going to happen. And that view of human nature, I do, not being as versed in political theory and history, political philosophy as others. I mean, you go from Locke, who talks about the tabula rasa, but that's no innate ideas. You're moving to a more open human nature, and then you get to Rousseau, who seems to think human nature is radically fluid, at least as it presents itself on the surface. And most people are going to read it that way. Most people won't get down to the bottom anyway. And so I think they were very impressed with the possibility that you can create a much more equal society. In addition, if they do accept some of the ancient idea that your regime shapes your character, they're going to say it's the second house and the kingly order, or the governor or the executive, that creates the hierarchy. You're creating it in the regime, as opposed to saying, no, it's happening by nature, and you accept it or not.
I have a little anecdote from my own research. So Benjamin Franklin, of course, has a big hand in writing the Pennsylvania Constitution. And that's one reason why the French are so enamored with it, because they're also enamored with Franklin. But I came across a letter where after Shays' Rebellion, Franklin writes, and of course, the governor of Massachusetts, Bowdoin, is very, very effective and active in putting Shays' Rebellion down. And Franklin writes, Governor Bowdoin says, you got the best constitution in the country. So even Franklin, by that point in time, was sort of moving away from what he had helped create. So.
Well, Franklin's interesting. Adams, his comment, he said the only known comment of Franklin's is oracular, discussing the second house. He says, well, it's kind of like people running a cart carrying heavy objects, and they're going down a hill. They have 4 horses, and it's a really steep hill. They put 2 of the horses facing the other way, so the cart doesn't tumble down the hill. And Adams says, that can be read in many ways. It can be very prudent to do that. Or it could be he's saying, that's what you're trying to do. I don't think it's necessary, because that's not our situation. But he said, he starts with Franklin's. He's trying, what have people said about why you need the second house for? There's an apocryphal story that Jefferson asked Washington, what's the second house for? And he says, why do you put your tea in your saucer before you drink it? That doesn't quite seem to be traceable, but that's kind of the idea. Yeah, it's very interesting. The other thing is, why did Shays happen in Massachusetts when that was in theory a better constitution? And that's a whole other story.
Does that, as you say, he looks back in history and finds something about mixed regime everywhere. But of course, the logic of the mixed regime originally was that you had different principles of justice that would be represented by these particular, a monarch and lords, and then more popular democratic element. Adams doesn't seem to have cottoned to that.
No, that's precisely what he does not cotton to. Maybe that doesn't work also, but yeah, he seems.
Does he seem to recognize the difference, or?
He doesn't talk about it. That's interesting. I don't know if he's not talking about it because he doesn't want to mention it and say I disagree, but he definitely thinks justice is more unified, and maybe that's the way he sees it. I don't know. He doesn't see it that way. The justice of the one, the few, the many. That's true. Yeah. Maybe the criticism is that's what he's producing, of course, and he doesn't. And you get all these fights about it. Jefferson actually, I think, seemed to have keep the first edition of the Defense from being reprinted in America because that's what they saw it doing, I think. Yeah. And he calls its writings heresies.
Yeah. Is that because Adams wasn't as careful a writer as he should have been?
Well, that's the irony. Adams is not an esoteric writer. The terms are perfectly current. I mean, there's a letter from the governor of Massachusetts, Francis Bernard, who's normal Oxford-educated guy, not particularly, not dumb, but not great intellectual. He writes, I think one of his advisors back in London, I'll give you some parts of this letter that are exoteric and some esoteric. That was not a surprising concept to them. But Adams thought that's not fair. Everybody, you have the same. Now, sometimes the truth can be ironic, and he would explain things ironically. That's separate, right? But he thought, essentially, you present the same idea basically and bluntly to everybody. That's actually not good politics. But it is also, when the attempt to hide what you're saying is aristocratic. And his soul rebels against that. So the irony of Adams is precisely that. Yeah. He doesn't actually believe in being politic because that would be unfair. That would be hierarchical.
You didn't get a chance to talk about it much, but obviously Adams has quite a lot to say about sort of executive power. How does it fit in more broadly with the separation of power system you talked about? And also then the second thing is, if you could speculate about how you think that his view of executive power actually shaped his behavior when he became president.
Yeah, he's the guy who spoke of the unity, secrecy, and dispatch in early '87, so before Wilson and Hamilton talked about it. And he definitely thought you have to execute, you have to do, or as Grant said, I am a verb. And so that has to be a person. When there's two people, you don't have accountability, don't have a clear line of authority. Or as one comedian said, if you only have one child, you're not really a parent because you know who did it, right? So you want to have one person so you know who did it, right? And he also thinks you need a veto. He would prefer a full veto because that protects the executive from being run by the legislature. And then you no longer have the independence he needs to do his job. And so the job of the executive that he focuses on, the separation of powers isn't really under threat by the time he writes the Defense Constitution. He mentions it regularly, that you have to separate executive, legislative, and judicial powers. And by then, the judicial power is out of the executive. It, of course, had been in the executive branch under the king. And he focuses on, you need to have the president elected presumably by the people, because you need essentially the dynamic between the president and the commons to keep those aristocratic senators essentially in line, because otherwise they'll get too big for their britches. So he kind of expects a certain form of dynamic between the president and the people. This maybe is a court country version, maybe our term for certain populism. It's ironic given Adams' ideas, that they work together to keep the government itself from becoming an interest against the people. Because it's very common throughout history for the people in office to use their powers to line their own pockets. So keeping the executive separate from the other two branches is definitely part of that. Otherwise, there will be a problem of control on the various branches. You can't have a government of laws, it says, without the separation of powers. Because if you combine any of the two powers, it'll be used arbitrarily.
Yeah. I do know he complained about the U.S. Constitution, the mix of the Senate with the president on appointments and treating him. He really did not want that mix there. Yeah. I mean, in that sense, he really did want to ostracize the senators. One final question from me, and before we turn to the audience. So, as you presented it, Adams thinks that the question of human inequality is really at the heart of how he thinks about, sort of the regime and what has to be done institutionally. How would he respond to Tocqueville's argument that, in the American experience, it's equality that's the major concern? How would Adams square that circle?
I wonder if
or if he would.
If it's so different in the middle of the first volume of the defense, in the original version as opposed to the reshuffled version, there is essentially all of Book 8 and the start of Book 9 of Plato's Republic, the movement of the regimes, and you get democratic men is where the idea of equality pervades, and you can read Tocqueville as a commentary on that. You have this intense love of equality, and standards come down. And what are our checks on that? And Tocqueville talks about various aspects of it, the civil society and other things. And you could see, one might suspect Adams is worried, what's going to be our tendency? It's going to be down. Too much equality, an excess of equality, leading us away from the need to have something else. And so he's pushing back against that, anticipating what's going to be a second, third, fourth generation problem. Whereas I think in the South, I believe Colin Sheen puts it quite directly in her book on Madison, they want to tear down the slaveholding aristocracy. So they're worried that we have to start to get down to equality. Whereas New England, yes, you have the grandees of a certain sort, the Winthrops, and you have the Essex Junto and others, but they don't really have, their status is not so high. And the concern is, as you move forward a few generations, he says, I'm writing for a country of 100, 200 million people a century hence, right? So I wonder if it is on his mind, and he's trying to push against that by giving something to push us to look up, because our tendency will be look to bring everything down to equality.
Yeah, when I was looking at his first address to Congress, and of course it's in the context of everybody's, he's too monarchical, he's not Republican enough. And so he spends a lot of time trying to bat that down. But very subtly, in various little spots, he sort of indirectly says, but of course this Constitution probably will need to be changed as we move along. I mean, so even then, when it would have been the most politic thing for him to do is not even suggest such, he was, as you say, being very blunt about, about these matters.
He's not known for being politic in many cases.
All right, turn to questions. So please wait for a mic and also just identify yourself.
Professor Samuelson, first of all, thanks for bringing John Adams to life in a way that I had not experienced him in the past. I do want to follow, my name is William Edwards, and I do want to follow up on a question that was asked by Professor Schmidt, is that right? About how Adams might take the modern administrative state, the modern executive branch. Today the executive branch it doesn't legislate, but it can pass rules with the force of law. It doesn't appropriate, but most of the agencies within the federal government get their money on basically a continuing resolution, kind of an autopilot. It doesn't adjudicate as an Article III court might, but today there are plenty of administrative law judges and administrative judges that have a quasi-judicial function. So some have pointed to the kind of reunification of power as like, well, that's the deep state, that's the administrative state. So my question is, do you think that President Adams, or as a writer, as a founder, he anticipated this kind of re-centralization of power in the executive? And if you could get out your Ouija board and tell us what you think he might have given us in advice to counter the re-centralization of power, if you agree that that's possibly the explanation for where we find ourselves today.
If I took him my Ouija board, he might say, no, that's that nonsense from Salem. But I wonder if there is some anticipation of the turn towards, to use the current term, technocracy in some of the philosophers. You have the one house, but the people who really do things would be the well-trained French, I don't know, not aristocrats, but gentlemen, people who once you go to titles in the French schools. I mean, you can see the roots of that in some of the writings of the era. And so you have the one house, but then you're going to have a large administrative branch. The French are great at bureaucracy. I think we Americans actually, our character is not good at it, but that's a different issue. I wonder if the Adamsian analysis today is we have a mixed up regime. That is, we have all this power without checks and balances. We transform the government after the New Deal. I mean, Jefferson says of Shays' Rebellion, a little revolution every now and then is healthy. No little matters as much as revolution. And all as things go, Shays wasn't all that serious. He calls the election of 1800 the revolution of 1800. That is, through what we would call realignments, you have kind of punctuated equilibrium. You redo the way you do the system. And we got the modern state without thinking about where are checks and balances here? Well, that's 18th century talk. That's this backwards Newtonian stuff. That's what they said at the time. I think it's the first line of the big book about Adams' political thought by Career Walsh and the progressive era was, the political science in this book is out of date. Right? That's the idea, right? But I wonder if, I don't know if there's a way to do it, if there'd be a way to put some kind of checks and balances into our administrative bureaucracy. Because from the outside, you can say, this looks like what Governor Bernard proposed. You know, we don't really have gentlemen here. We need a civil list. That is, a lot of people the king pays for who are well trained and have good breeding, and they can run things and get away from this legislature that has entirely too much power. It's the wrong sort of people governing. And there could be an echo of that in what we're seeing today, that we haven't reconstitutionalized the big state. You're going to have a state, you're going to have some kind of administrative work that is out of proportion to what you had in that era. The question is, what is its constitutional design? And maybe that's an issue we haven't quite thought about. Maybe there's no way to do it, to put some kind of checking and balancing. And notice both checking and balancing. I recently had to retaught again, and I hadn't noticed before. The Calhoun's, I think we did draft, the South Carolina Exposition and Protest. The word check or checking or a version of that comes up, I think it's 14 times, but the word balance never, which is actually very interesting, right? You need both. You need a check, but you need something to balance to keep the forces in line.
So, back here, please.
Hi, Michael Lucchese. I'm with Law and Liberty. I am very curious. The image that you gave of Adams as Sancho Panza to the Philosophes Don Quixote is very interesting, and it put me in mind a little bit of Machiavelli in The Prince, where he talks about how we have to throw out imagined republics, and we have to sort of have a new science of politics that moves beyond the sort of antique conception of an imagined republic. So I was wondering, to what extent do you think Machiavelli's realism is an influence on Adams's realism, and how would you situate that in the founding, especially considering somebody like Leo Strauss saying that the founding was an explicitly anti-Machiavellian moment? Thank you.
Well, I think Strauss says Machiavelli didn't say anything others hadn't said, but he only said it within a certain range. And Adams is very much, he speaks in some ways ruthlessly empirically to say, look, guys, these things aren't going to work. We've seen these patterns too many times in the past to expect you to these imagined republics to work, right? But the problem is they thought the imagined republics aren't imagined. They just haven't been tried yet, right? Adams says, no, these are kooky ideas that can't work, right? And you can say in some ways they cross the fine line that separates idealism and misanthropy, right? If you'll only be content in this world, if we can do things that are actually incompatible with human nature, you don't like human nature, you don't like human beings. And that might be why there's a line to the terror and other such terrors by people who want to transform the world. They're expecting something that human nature cannot give. But it's interesting, one of the big portions of the defense, Adams quotes at length the Florentine histories, and every now and then he says, Machiavelli knows better, that's not really what really happened, and he periodically pauses and criticizes him. So I think Adams very much goes back to the rule of law. He quotes a lost text of Cicero that's preserved by Augustine, if I remember correctly, right at the start of the defense. He quotes Aristotle later on what the rule of law means. And it's not mere will, it is definitely living in accord with the deeper transcendent order in which we find ourselves. I think that would definitely put a line between him and Machiavelli. And I think he knows that. But who's he talking to? He's talking to a lot of people who wouldn't have worked all that through. And I think he finds tactically that the empirical approach is very useful, because he's saying, are you really going to say all these examples are not reflecting a pattern that seems to be inescapable of human life? And what's interesting, my fellow historians, Joyce Appleby calls it, his 3 volumes of tendentious historical extracts. This is not the way we do history anymore. And so it's interesting. I think he's actually not taking the Machiavelli. Oh, the other way he responds to Machiavelli, he's emphatic about the ancient definition of republic. If I remember correctly, as Paul Ray, my colleague on the main campus, points out, the classic distinction between despotisms and republics. Despotism rule by and for the despot. Republic, there is a public, there's a republica. And Machiavelli makes it a form question. There's monarchies and republics. And Adams keeps saying, well, that actually isn't helpful because you're going to want someone who looks kind of like a king at the center of the order. You're going to want something that looks like a somewhat aristocratic Senate, the center. And it's still a republic. That's the way the word has been used through most of history. And that's where he explicitly pushes back against Machiavelli. He doesn't cite him, but he's very emphatic that it's a mistake to have this modern simplification between republics and monarchies. And he quotes Coke calling England a commonwealth, among other things.
There's a question over here, I thought. Nope. Please.
I'm David Epstein. The U.S. Senate doesn't have a property qualification either for the electors or for the senators. So is that sufficiently close to a mixed regime to satisfy Adams? I mean, in general, did he think the U.S. Constitution was more or less the mixed regime he thought was needed, or did he think it did not actually do what was necessary to solve the basic inequality problem?
I think he was worried it was insufficient. But I do wonder, back when the Senate was selected by the states, that it would have worked somewhat differently. That is, I mean, how do you get Henry Clay there? You have a direct connection between the person who runs politics in Kentucky, which means he's directly in touch with every town and county, into the heart of the Senate. And that would, the play of ambitions might actually work when the Senate really was the world's greatest deliberative body, or had a claim for it at least, right? When you cap the House and expand the Senate, the difference isn't there. I wonder if you tried a whimsical experiment, I don't know if you need property qualification. Suppose you reorder things and you made 13 districts, each with 2 senators, and expanded the House to 800 people. Then when a senator walks into a room, you say, wow, right? And it would really pop, and they would feel that in their own lives, and maybe they would take the responsibility that came with that. I don't know, but I think he was a little worried. He was worried long term that we had not done a sufficient job to make the Senate functional. It could be in our circumstance, there simply was no way, and he was wrong to think this could ever possibly work, to make the Senate as kind of internal ostracism. So it's an open question. And sometimes his writing says, yeah, no, this is not what I'm looking for. Other times he's more supportive of it.
Yeah. I mean, just thinking about the Massachusetts Constitution, I mean, there were property qualifications. And there's an oath, had to be Christian.
Yep.
So, I mean, I suppose looking back, Adams would probably said, what I did in Massachusetts is better than what they did in the US Constitution.
Yes, relatively significant property qualification. Not to vote. That was like, basically, anyone who could own a car nowadays would vote. But to be a senator or governor. But I'm not sure, the religious stuff is partly Adams catering to Massachusetts. He would not write he wrote the Religious Liberty Clause, that is, everyone can worship God as their conscience tells them. But Article 3, he said, I can't write that. And that's where they said, well, each town can choose which church or churches to support. And actually, I wonder if he saw what was going to happen. You give people religious liberty, and each town picks one or more church to support with tax funds. What's going to happen? Well, soon enough, these things are incommensurable when you get more and more denominations in Massachusetts, and they vote to say, yeah, we don't want that anymore. It's not functional.
So I'm going to ask the last question, and we only got a minute left, so it's got to be a quick one. You ended your talk by talking about the fact that Adams had a view that government could shape character, the citizen's character and the politician's character. And actually, it reminds me a little bit of Alexander Hamilton, also makes a kind of similar argument about steady government leading to a certain kind of character in the population. What is the virtue, though, that comes from that? I mean, what is it that Adams thinks that having a kind of a stable, government is going to? What kind of Republican virtue does that produce?
In 1 minute.
Yeah.
Well, so I mean, Adams didn't think it can. He thinks it always does, inevitably, for good or for ill. So you can't. I sometimes call this the anti-libertarian point. It's not a question of whether government you choose to have government-shaped morality or not. It always does, and the question is how. And Adams thought you create a positive emulation. You draw people up to their better selves because we are status-seeking creatures, and he used that to the benefit of everybody. You can, in a sense, move their souls to be better people if the regime forces them to serve the public, in a sense, to serve themselves. Enlightened self-interest pushes you towards something looking like virtue.
Good. Well, that's a great note to end on, and please, if everybody would join me in thanking Richard for a wonderful talk and a great discussion.